I want to welcome you to the Ageno School of Business's Innovation and Practice series. Today, we're going to talk about maximizing collaboration in the new hybrid workplace. And it's my pleasure to introduce John Ford. John is a workplace mediator, a trainer, and the producer of the Empathy set of cards, which you will see in your chat. He's also an author. His book, Peace at Work, is designed to support HR managers to mediate themselves. And luckily for us, John was also a GGU adjunct, bringing his expertise to our students for many years. So as we begin, please put your questions in the Q&A, and welcome, John. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Sue-Ann. And thank you also to Irene, Shweet, and Zenas, who've helped get everything ready for today's presentation. And of course, everyone who's here today. I'm really looking forward to our time together. In terms of a quick review of the agenda, in sort of the main, what I'm hoping to do is to consider the many ways in which the world of work has changed. So that's sort of the first context that I'd like to explore. And then part of my presentation is going to be suggesting that collaboration remains as important, if not more important, as we embrace this new and changed world that we are encountering and all the new different kinds of concerns and challenges that we face. We run down some of the topics that we'll be exploring, like, for example, from rupture to repair, reflective listening, addressing the pain of the past. What these topics sort of address is how we address conflict at a practical level so that we can be collaborative. And a lot of what I'll be sharing with you is actually what I share with folks as I'm starting to mediate, where I'm giving them their just-in-time briefing as to how they can show up to have a collaborative conversation with one another where they have had a challenge. And as Sue-Ann mentioned, we will be doing Q&A at the end, so hopefully there'll be time for your questions then. All right, so first up, always good to define terms. And, I think until COVID came along, for the most part, we were aware of the traditional workplace where people got a job and it was expected that you showed up at work. And then there was also teleworking. And now we have those two. We have the traditional workplace, we have teleworking, and we also have this new category of remote workers, and we also have the hybrid workspace. So just very quickly to say, following what's going on in the federal sector, they define teleworking as someone who comes into the office at least twice during a 2-week period. And by contrast, someone who's a remote worker isn't expected to come to the office at all. But essentially, what we can say is that the hybrid workspace is an environment in which there's a split between those that are in the office and those who are either teleworking or working remotely. Now, what's of interest, as you can see from the quote at the bottom, is that while some organizations are hybrid, some are still traditional in the sense that everyone comes to the office, and some have moved in the pure remote direction. And the hardest to manage is the hybrid workplace. In other words, where there's a blend of the two. It's how do you address these two different environments? All right. Times are changing, and with those changing times, expectations are changing too. Here's some statistics that I'm going to quickly run through just to give you a flavor of what's really going on. And I know as I'm sharing this, this is all based on your own direct experience that you've been having. In other words, this is the reality that we've all been living. So first up in this environment, and it's certainly been true for me, is that I'm doing a whole lot less commuting. And the average time saving is around about 40 minutes daily that people are saving. Interestingly, up to 70% of folks got to work from home at the sort of the peak of COVID. And after COVID, the expectation, 92% of folks expect this, that they're going to work at home at least 1 day per week. In other words, that would be the teleworking, and 80% expect to work at least 3 days per week from home. 23% said they'll take a 10% cut to be able to work from home permanently. So that's the pure remote work option. And then also interesting, but not only are we saving time in terms of commuting, a lot of us are saving money, up to $500 per month, which translates to around about $6,000 a year. Some, and this is certainly going to be one of those issues where there is the potential for conflict. In other words, who picks up the tab for home office equipment and furnishing? And currently, I don't know whether that's a right sort of adjective to say, a mere 20 to 25% of companies are paying for that. A lot of folks are now expecting that their employer will continue to support remote work after COVID. So as people have got used to it, the expectation is it's going to continue. And that also that attitude towards remote work and teleworking is going to play a part in which jobs people accept. So again, I don't think this is new for anyone. I think we're all aware of how dramatically the times have changed, and certainly that expectations have changed too. And just to give you a feel for this, this is what I kind of call late breaking news. Watch this video. And I do want to apologize for the quality of the video. The sound is good, but this is in fact the quality of the video itself. But listen to this. This is what we call I would almost suggest an inappropriate way to lay off. But let's have a listen.
I'm doing this, and I do not want to do this. The last time I did it, I cried. This time I hope to be stronger. But we are laying off about 15% of the company.
You gotta be kidding me.
Efficiency and performances and productivity.
Only did for the company?
If you're on this call, you are part of the unlucky group being laid off. Your employment here is terminated effective immediately. What does this mean for what's next? You're going to get an email from HR. Ask HR. I'm doing this.
So there you go. I don't think it takes a lot of sensitivity to appreciate that that's probably not the way to go about doing it. But that's, I suppose, the nature of the dilemmas that we face in this era is how do we do things that we would have traditionally thought would have been appropriate to do in person? And so there's a whole bucket of concerns that are coming up. They're not necessarily purely new concerns. In other words, how we collaborate with one another, how we communicate with one another, how we build and end relationships, what technology we use to support our work, how we address issues relating to equity and fairness, the relationship between manager autonomy and worker discretion, and then health and safety. These are not new issues for workers, but they're new in our new context with these changing expectations. And just to flesh them out a little bit, just to give you a nature of the common concerns that I think we can expect, and maybe concerns is a polite way of saying some of the conflicts that we're going to have. For example, when it comes to collaboration, it's going to be, well, what software are we using? And are we all on the same page about that? And then if we are collaborating, a lot of times people say it makes sense for us to do so in person. But what happens if you have a remote worker? So now you have 6 people around the table and 2 of the team are away. Do you move to fully remote? Or do you go to a hybrid model where you have some people around the table in the office and some people are on video conferencing? Some companies have a one Zoom, all Zoom rule, but whatever, these are the kinds of issues that are going to have to be addressed as it pertains to collaboration. The same with communication in the sense of software or meeting rules. In other words, what are the expectations around our meeting rules? For example, are we expected to have our video on, or is it acceptable for it to be off? Can we multitask and do the dishes while we're muted on a meeting, or are we expected to give our full attention to the meeting? Are there times of the day where we don't get called? Are there no meeting days? Again, these are all issues where people will have opinions, and there's going to be the potential for concerns or conflict. Relationship building. This morning when I woke up, I had onboarding, networking, and conflict resolution there, and I added layoffs. But these are all classic activities that historically would have been expected to have been done in person. And I think increasingly, as we saw maybe inappropriately in that video, there's going to be a move to doing them remotely. And certainly for remote workers, all of this has to be done through some form of electronic communication. Also in the context of relationship building, drawing the distinction between those that are in leadership roles as opposed to individual contributors. And so for the individual contributors, especially the knowledge workers, maybe less need to be in the office, but certainly from a leadership perspective, there may be that expectation that you do come into the office. As it pertains to technology, I think the big issue that we're facing now is, do we all have adequate bandwidth to do our jobs, and who's responsible for providing that? Because obviously bandwidth affects our ability to be on both audio and video. There have also been already disputes that have arisen because someone was rudely muted by someone who had access to the controls and they felt cut off. And then the question of who picks up the tab for the hardware. as we saw in that previous slide with some of the statistics, somewhere around about 20 to 25% of companies are starting to pick up that tab. But that again, there are going to be expectations around that. Again, equity and fairness is not new. And the big areas we've got to watch for are performance reviews, promotions, and opportunities. And are there going to be advantages for those folks that come into the office, or is the status of whether you're a traditional office worker, a teleworker, or a remote worker, is that going to matter? And ideally, it is suggested that results and quality should count, not your status. The work-life blur, which can tilt in both directions, in other words, both sides of the equation can be taking advantage of it. But whatever, that has the potential to lead to a perception of unfairness. And then also, again, it sort of ties in with the collaboration and communication topic. When people aren't in the office, when they aren't participating in the meeting in person, do they have the same voice and influence as when they are around the table? As it pertains to manager autonomy and worker discretion, this is where we see a little bit of the power struggle and the shifting power dynamics. Really, at this point in time, with the economy the way it is and unemployment being so low, workers have a lot more power. And then also, based on the experience of how we all pulled through COVID together, sort of the expectation that teleworking and remote working isn't a privilege, but almost expected as a right now. But managers still will like to see themselves as gatekeepers and determiners of who has position eligibility. In other words, which positions are eligible for remote work, and will have to watch out for their implicit biases. And then finally, just to say that, you know, health and safety issues will continue to be in the forefront of a lot of employees and students' minds, whether it relates to vaccination expectations, wearing of masks, how you demonstrate safety through testing, whether events are perceived as being spreader events and unsafe, whether there's expectations around travel, conferences, and then also just the reality that all of this has been debilitating and led to a lot of burnout all around, and how that gets addressed. So more just to what it's wanting to do is more just to touch on the reality of the changing landscape, and that in this context, in the workplace, we're going to have to continue being collaborative. And maybe in short, just to say what we can conclude from all of this is that conflict will remain inevitable. We are going to continue to have conflict, and that collaboration will remain essential. And if you're wondering why I say collaboration remains essential, and now we're going to transition into this part of the presentation, in my field, there are what are referred to as the 5 conflict management strategies. And the way we explore them are through the 2 interrelated criteria of relationship and outcome. So when we value relationship and we value outcome, it's suggested that we are collaborative. And clearly in the workplace, outcome is always paramount. There's no one who's doing a job anywhere that isn't important. And the relationships are also important. But just to contextualize that, because it's not to say that we only collaborate, we always need to be versatile and know when to avoid. Sometimes it makes sense to avoid, but again, not when the relationship and outcome is important. There are also times when we want to accommodate. These are both are healthy strategies at times. Competition, we sometimes think of as a way of life, and it certainly is on the sports field. But again, ultimately in the workplace, where outcome and relationship are important, collaboration and related compromise are really important. And just to flesh this out, just so that you can sort of see where this kind of comes from, you can see this is really the flight response. There's the fight response. What we have to watch for those of us that tend towards avoiding an accommodation is passive-aggressive behavior. And for those of us that tend towards being competitive and fighting, we have to watch for the pure aggression. But in terms of collaboration, what we're hoping for always is folks that are going to be highly cooperative and also assertive. So those, to my mind, really are the skills of the collaborative worker, both cooperative and assertive. But before we go too far and get away from the topic of or the relationship with conflict, I wanted to explore that a little bit more with you. And again, what I'm actually sharing with you now is actually the presentation that I use when I'm preparing for folks for a mediation. And the way I like to start is with the proverbial circle, because in pretty much all cultures of the world, there's a lot of positive associations we can draw from the circle. The circle typically represents unity and wholeness. And in the context of our relationships, we can say that we're complete and current. In other words, we don't have baggage from the past. We're able to be present. There's nothing from the past that's bothering us, and we're not anxious about the future. We're completely complete and current in our interconnected relationships. But as already noted, conflict is inevitable. In other words, there are ruptures to that unity of the circle, and when we rupture the circle, we're left with the letter C. So typically we can say a conflict occurs when someone says something or doesn't do something or doesn't say something, and it leads to that rupture because we have a sort of a perception that our needs are not being met, and we experience this as a conflict. And so a key question that we always need to ask for ourselves is, how do we restore unity after a particular rupture? Again, recognizing that this is inevitable. And let's just take a simple example. Imagine you've got a colleague or a fellow student that routinely interrupts you, never really lets you finish what you want to say. The danger of how we go about restoring this little intersection, this is really, to me, where all the action lies, is like, how do we go restoring that unity, is that the person is going to make a judgment. They may say something like, you're rude, you never listen to me, and you always interrupt. Now, we also have to be very careful about those never and always words. But as you can see, as much as this may be inappropriately worded, what this person is trying to convey to their colleague or their fellow student is that there's behaviors that they're exhibiting that are not helpful, and they'd like to change those so that the relationship can restore to a more harmonious form. If you communicate like that, it's going to be perceived as an attack. And inevitably, when people perceive themselves to be in some ways attacked or put down, they also go to judgment and they say something like, no, I'm not, and you do too. And then, in other words, they get defensive. And then we get into this tragic little spiral. In fact, this is really an eye for an eye. You hurt me, and now I get to hurt you back. That we still see taking place over and over in this world. A fascinating researcher, John Gottman from up in Seattle, he's famous for the Love Lab, where he predicts with around about 95% accuracy whether a couple will stay together or not. And the element of his four horsemen that he focuses on are the displays of contempt. So I encourage you, if you don't know what contempt looks like, to go and make sure you know what the the display of contempt looks like. But he says these are the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So as we can see there, we've got the defensiveness, and that's really where we all have a great opportunity in life, is to be the bigger person. To say, not just to say, oh, because you did this to me, I'm going to respond in kind, but to break the cycle. So there's a lot of empowerment in that space. But the other two behaviors that he cautions us against are criticizing and stonewalling, and I like adding blame as a fifth. But essentially, what this is pointing to are all the ways in which we don't restore unity after a particular rupture, the ways in which we perpetuate the pain and we lead to escalations. So if those are the ways that lead it to an escalation and to things being worse, what is a better way? And very simply, in terms of the technology that we have amongst ourselves for getting along, to quote the late Rodney King, he asked that famous question, why can't we all just get along, is to use I statements. So for example, we may say, I feel frustrated. We express our feeling. When people talk before I finished, notice that I didn't say when people interrupt me, because that's got a judgmental tone. So I'm very observational. When people talk before I finished, because understanding my full message is important, that's my need. I'd really appreciate you letting me finish first before you share. So that's really the four elements of an I statement. Marshall Rosenberg was famous for advocating for this in his book, Nonviolent Communication. In fact, he always say that if we can acknowledge another human being's feelings and needs, we give them empathy. So expressing ourselves in this way gives us a better chance of being heard and restoring that unity. And if the other person can listen empathically, we have a good chance of getting to some kind of a harmonious resolution. Now, another thing I want to point out from John Gottman, the same sort of researcher, as he points out, and again, this is in the context of married couples, but I think we can translate this into all our life relationships. He says 33% of issues are resolvable, 67% are what he calls perpetual problems. So what this really means is that given the inevitable diversity, and I'm not talking about what I think of as skin deep diversity, I'm talking about the more nuanced ways in which some folks are introverted and others are extroverted. Some are analytical and some are intuitive. Some are, rule followers, and some like to make exceptions. Some people are very time sensitive and some people are looser with time. That's building off the Myers-Briggs dimensions. But it helps you see how, for example, if you have someone who's an extrovert working with someone who's an introvert, there's going to be mischief. If you have someone working with, who's intuitive with someone who's analytical, there's going to be mischief. So that's what gives rise to these perpetual problems that we either face in a mature way and find sensible solutions to, or we perpetuate them by personalizing them, by getting defensive, etc. So the reality is there always will be issues. And again, I think what we know is that there are going to be new problems that are on the horizon as a result of the changes that are occurring in our society. But still, in summary, a better way for us to communicate when there is a rupture is to use I statements, to listen empathically. But if we pull back now from this as really looking at conflict at the micro level to a more macro, oh, sorry, my bad. Before we get to that macro level that I want to take you to, please forgive me for this very quick review of listening, because as you can see in this previous slide, I emphasize, listen to understand empathically. We all know and we all think we like to think that we're great listeners. This year I had the privilege of training over 100 California labor commissioners in the skills of mediation. And at the end of the training, we asked the participants, what is your key takeaway? And overwhelmingly, the number one skill that they all said was most important to them was active listening or empathic listening. So just for a very quick review, so we're all on the same page, because again, this is going to be a really helpful collaborative skill for everyone in the future, is acknowledging that when we communicate, we may have an idea or a concept or some information that we want to convey to the other, and we want them to receive it in the way that we intend it. So in other words, we see the communication going from us to the other person. And the only way that we know whether that person has received that information accurately is when they feed it back to us. They close the loop to demonstrate understanding. So where my message may have been XYZ 9/12/15, when the person replies and says XYZ 9/11/15, I know we're close, but not quite there. And I clarify and say, no, Z, not Z, 12, not 11. And the listener says, oh, XYZ 9/12/15. And I say, yes, you got it. And they say, phew. So that, as simple as it is really a recipe for harmony in life. The more we do this, the more we have a shared reality, something that is truly elusive for the most part, and we have less misunderstandings. In a lot of industries, misunderstandings lead to inconvenience, but in some, there can be dire consequences. For example, in healthcare, when there's a misunderstanding, it can lead to death. When we give our credit card number to someone over the telephone and we get one digit wrong, the person doesn't get the money that they want and the transaction doesn't go through. So there are some contexts where it really does matter. But as the listener, just to quickly point to 3 behaviors that we want to watch and guard against, the first would be tuning out. In other words, while we're listening to the person, we're thinking about what we're going to have for lunch. The second is we rehearse. In other words, as we're waiting for the person to finish what they're saying, we're rehearsing. And then finally, we prejudge. In other words, we think, I know what this person's going to say. They've said it all before. I don't need to listen to them again. And so we close ourselves to their message. So that's just a very, very quick review, as I say, of listening. And again, just to underscore that in healthcare, that's an industry where it really, really does matter, where people literally do die. In fact, in all hospitals that are now regulated by the Joint Commission, they mandate readback. So anytime vital information passes, say, from a nurse to a doctor or from a doctor to a laboratory person, it must be read back for verification, because there have been too many preventable errors that have led to unexpected adverse outcomes that were really dire. And as I said, the other example of the credit card number where we give that over the telephone. That was that just quick little indulgence. And then the final point before leaving this little review of listening, just to say, and this is such a key insight, because so often what I find is that people are afraid to use their skill of active listening because they're afraid that if they demonstrate that they've understood, the other person is going to think that they're agreeing with them. So I just want to underscore for you and to say, demonstrating understanding does not mean that we are agreeing with them. We sometimes can even literally say that. but there's still something really beneficial for us all when we can let one another know that we've heard them as they've intended. It really is a tool for harmony in our lives. So now moving on. So from that was really more to micro level to sort of coming a little bit more to the macro level. As you can see here in this little slide, and I'm going to flesh it out for you so that you can get a better feel for what I mean by this macro level. Under the word present, I have the horizontal line. That's what I think of as the proverbial line in the sand. So I find using the proverbial line in the sand to be a very helpful sort of, I suppose, orientation for folks in conflict, because the minute you have a line in the sand, it creates a past and it also creates a future. And one of the key sort of, I suppose, attitudes or focuses in conflict resolution is to say it's helpful to focus on the future. So where the first question at a micro level was, how do we restore unity after a rupture? At the macro level, as you can see here, I'm asking, how do we move beyond the pain of the past? And again, this is one of the questions and the slides that I use when I'm orienting folks that I'm mediating with to get them thinking. Now, don't worry, I don't put them on the spot, and you also don't have to worry that I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm going to share with you how I view it as a way of orienting them to their choices and also motivating them to participate fully in the mediation session that I'm preparing for them. And I'm not suggesting you have to be mediators, but you can also, this very same question applies to you in your interpersonal lives and the teams that you lead, and just in any relationship context that you may find yourself in. So just to orient us, I've already established we've got the line in the sand. We've got that representing the present. We've got a past and the future. And then in the past, you can see our circle representing unity. And to me, typically what that represents, the point of time in which the two people that I'm working with or the team that I'm working with started their relationship, that there was a sense of unity, of purpose, that like, oh, great to welcome this newcomer to the team, or, my first day of work was such and such, and that's when my relationship with X started. So we generally give the benefit of the doubt that at the very beginning it was good. So we'll move away from that. And beneath that, as you can see there, the letters C, D, and O. C is going to stand for conflict, and sort of very simply is defined as a struggle about perceived differences. D is a more escalated form of conflict. A dispute is the point at which, where we have a conflict, we make a demand of someone. So in that example of the interruption, the point at which I say to them, you need to stop interrupting me now. If I make a demand, and I may even say, or else, and they say, oh, sure, I can do that. That means that I've made a demand and they've said yes. That means we have an agreement. If I make a demand, you need to stop interrupting me now or else, and they say no, that's when we have a dispute. In other words, a dispute is a demand that's been negated, and the little O represents resolution. In other words, a conflict and a dispute that's been addressed. So given that we know that conflict is inevitable in any relationship, let's just sort of map out what things could look like. So day one is to say there was unity. That could be a week later that there's the first conflict. And there we go, we got another conflict. Oh, good, we've got a resolution, that's great. But that other conflict that didn't get resolved has now escalated into a dispute. And while that dispute hasn't been addressed, a new conflict surfaced and another one hot on the heels of that one. A little bit of time goes by, maybe a little bit of artificial or some kind of harmony, but now here we have a new conflict, and that's also escalated into a dispute. Another conflict, and another conflict, or there's another dispute, oh, another resolution, that's great, and another conflict. So as you can see, and again, one could map out for in any relationship, the various conflicts and disputes and resolutions that have occurred. But this to me is not uncommon. In other words, I'm sure for most of you, if you reflect on your important relationships, you'd be able to map out something like this. But now it brings us to that question of how do we move beyond the pain of the past? And again, coming back to the value of this line in the sand, it's really saying if we can get everyone to address the pain of the past, we can press that proverbial reset button and create a new opportunity for everyone moving forward. So what I suggest to folks, and this is based on both my experience and research, is that there are three paths. I'm sorry, there are three paths that lead to ultimately to new working agreements. In other words, that clarity about what the future looks like. The first path is the justice path. In other words, that involves fact-finding and a judge making a determination about who is right and who is wrong, and assigning consequences to those who are held accountable. So, for example, a couple of years ago, there was this Jeffrey Epstein, who later went on to commit suicide in a prison in Manhattan, was accused of abusing young women. And he then committed suicide, and a lot of people felt cheated out of their justice. And they wanted him to be held accountable for what he'd done. And he dodged that. But that is one of the paths. At the end of the Second World War, there were the Nuremberg trials, and that was following the justice path. In the workplace, what that typically looks like is someone goes and files a complaint with HR, there's an investigation, there's determination of who did something wrong, and sometimes as a result of that determination, a consequence. What I'm presenting when I'm, as I say, preparing folks for mediation, is I'm trying to point out to them that is a path that's available, and that they're always welcome to take it, but it's not what I offer. I'm not a judge, and so I don't offer the justice path. The other path that humans will use to move beyond the pain of the past is the forgiveness path. And I always like pointing out, forgiveness doesn't mean condemnation or forgetting. It really means acceptance that we can't change the past. Once the water is flown under the bridge, that's the way that it went. It sometimes can be hard and a bitter pill to swallow, but that's the reality. And as much as we sometimes think certain events are unforgivable, what we discover is that there are always people that have forgiven what we considered to be unforgivable. For example, there have been people that forgave the Nazis despite having been held in a concentration camp in the Second World War. So forgiveness is another path. And I also like to seed the idea, in other words, just to bring it into people's awareness, that forgiveness can be a helpful thing. But I also hasten to add that I'm neither a therapist or a priest, and so this is not what I come here to mandate. But again, I like just getting people to think about it. But what I do represent as a mediator is the reconciliation path. And so I spend a little bit of time unbundling exactly what I mean by reconciliation and how that's going to apply to us as we go through the process together. So the first thing is the acknowledgement. So where in justice we have fact-finding, in reconciliation we have acknowledgement. It's very hard for people to move on from a painful past when they're told to just forget it, or just to bluff that it didn't exist. There needs to be some level of acknowledgement that, yeah, something happened in the past. Now, there may be disagreement as to what that is. In other words, each person may have a different perception, but the greater the alignment between those perceptions, the better it's going to be. And so we do need to hold the space for that acknowledgement. And in fact, that's where I use the cards that Sue Ann was referring to, the feeling and needs cards. I have a very carefully calibrated process where everyone gets to express how they've been impacted by the past and to have their feelings and needs acknowledged. And I find that really helps. Another way in which I conceptualize it for the participants is to say, if you were walking outside and you tripped and you fell on a stake and you had a puncture wound in your thigh, and you were rushed off to the emergency room nearby and you needed stitches, and they were on the table and they were about to stitch you up, and you realized that they hadn't cleaned out the wound, you'd probably say to them, I know it's going to hurt, but please clean out this wound first before you stitch it up. So to my mind, that acknowledgement is the cleaning of the wound, where we allow the grit, the painful past, the emotions to surface and to be acknowledged so that we can come to the present line and then pivot and orient towards the future. So that's the first element, the acknowledgement. The second one is forbearance. In other words, when we come to reconcile, we come in peace. We're not coming for revenge. We're coming to work things out. The third element, and it's sort of similar to the acknowledgement element, is empathy. Firstly, for ourselves, firstly for the other, in other words, where the more folks can put themselves in the shoes of the other and try to imagine what it was like for them. Not me as you, but you as you, me trying to imagine myself to be you. What was it like? And to recognize that we all have a valid perspective. So that can be really powerful. But it's also to have empathy for ourselves. And this one I've really found sort of to be an interesting challenge to convey, because what we're essentially talking about is the proverbial pointing of the finger. And my hunch is that most of you know that when we point the finger, there are three fingers pointing back at us. So the things that we judge others of often are our sort of our own inner projections, the things that are yet to be resolved within us. And so it's sometimes to have empathy as well for ourselves and to be able to look at what I kind of call the mirror of humanity and to see the very thing that we're judging the other for, we may have done ourselves. And the way that I, after sort of sharing it, essentially the way I'm just sharing it to you now, I'll often say to folks, I'll say, my hunch is you all like honesty, and everyone nods, and you don't like it when you have a sense that someone's being misleading or dishonest, and everyone nods, and no one likes that. And then I say to them, if there's anyone here who's never told a lie in their lives, raise your hand. And what I find is that no hands go up. And I sort of say, so that's sort of the kind of self-empathy that I'm talking about, that we have to be careful about getting on too high a horse and judging others, because the very thing we're judging them for, we may have done ourselves. So again, and all of this is softening, in my view, preparing people for a different kind of a conversation in terms of how to work something out. The next two elements sort of kind of go together, the recognition of interdependence, and then finally problem solving. Interdependence is really recognizing that we're in this together. We need our harmony and mutual productivity to, to get our paycheck, to get whatever it is that we're after, but we can't go this alone. And then the problem solving, going back to the analogy of the wound, remember we wanted it cleaned out before it was stitched up. I always say the problem solving is kind of like stitching up the wound. And too often what I see is that in people's discomfort with conflict, they want to cut to the chase. They want to just get to the problem solving, and they don't want to go through that more tricky first step of acknowledgement, which is again why I find the feeling and needs card so helpful as a way of creating a safe way for people to express what it is that they've both felt and need, and to have some acknowledgement of the past so that they can move on. But that to me is in the broadest picture of what is going on when we reconcile, and it's being contextualized as a choice amongst three, not the justice, not the forgiveness, but the reconciliation path. Now, again, I'm a mediator, but these very same insights apply to every one of you in terms of your worlds. Often the temptation is we want the justice path. We want someone to say, to vindicate us, to say, you're right, the other person's wrong, and come to our rescue. But that very seldom works out. The forgiveness path is truly powerful, and it's amazing how we can make progress in life by being more forgiving. But to my mind, the skill that's really that we all need to develop to have productive collaborative futures is this reconciliation skill of how we go about resolving our differences. Now, at a more practical level, what this translates to, in my view, and this is the kind of language that often ends up in agreements that folks reach in what I'd call relational contexts, is saying these are our future norms as it relates to conflict management. So it says, when discussing challenging issues, we'll both strive not to get defensive. So you can see there we're trying to head off that first horse of the apocalypse, or the first of Gottman's horses of the apocalypse, the defensiveness, to really try to bring that back into people's awareness that we both need to be big in these circumstances. And then importantly, we will each take turns to share our perspective without interruptions. Once we have expressed our feelings and they've been acknowledged, so that's really that first part, the cleaning of the wound, the acknowledgement part that I was talking about, we will work to identify our needs before brainstorming solutions. That's the problem-solving part, the stitching. I just wanted to quickly say, in terms of we will each take turns to share our perspective without interruptions, one of the most powerful tools, communication tools that Stephen Covey found, was the talking stick. So I'm a big fan of the talking stick. It can literally just be a pen, doesn't have to be an elaborate anything, but it's just a way of marking and indicating who's the speaker and who's the listener. So a talking stick can be helpful, but again, first acknowledgement of the feelings, remembering when we acknowledge, it doesn't mean that we're agreeing, we're just saying, I get that you're hurt, I get that you're angry, I get that you're furious, whatever it may be, and then focusing in the future of, well, what do we need for the future before brainstorming solutions? And this needs before brainstorming solutions actually comes from a book that I suspect a number of you are familiar with, Getting to Yes by Fisher, Uri, and Patton. It's really been foundational in terms of negotiation classes all around the country, certainly in law schools, and also in terms of the practice of mediation. There's still a tremendous amount of wisdom encoded in this book. And so in terms of that needs before brainstorming solutions, I've distilled it into what I call the problem-solving two-step. Again, remember, this is where we're doing the stitching. And very basically, as you can see, we have a T-bar where we have participant A's got needs. On the other side of the T-bar, we've got participant B's needs. And then in the second step of our little two-step, we brainstorm solutions. And you can see that dividing line is gone, because at that point, we're looking for solutions that meet both sides' needs. And just to bring it to life for you, I'm going to give you an example. Some years ago, I got asked by the city of Oakland to mediate between the owners of an apartment block down by Lake Merritt and the Tenants Association. And the real dispute centered on the rentals. As I think we all know, Oakland's a rent-controlled city. There were relatively new owners of the building, and they were doing their very best, it seemed, to get long-term tenants out so they could refurnish their apartment and put it back on the market for a much, much higher rental. So that was really the focus of the dispute. And that was in the pre-Zoom days. So that was definitely in person, and we were meeting at City Hall in Oakland. And I think we'd had one session, we'd made some progress. I got there for the second session. The owners arrived, and a good 40 minutes late, the Tenants Association walked in. And they were, for the most part, an elderly group. And their spokesperson sat down and almost immediately expressed his frustration about where we were meeting. He said, "This is the last time we meet here." And he got his finger out and he pointed and he said, "From now on, all meetings have to be at the apartment block." And I was, to be quite honest, a little surprised. I hadn't seen that coming, but we always have to meet our reality. And so I didn't try to minimize or deny his experience. I said, "That sounds really difficult and a little frustrating. Would you care to share a little bit more about why you're insisting that all meetings take place at the apartment block?" He said, "Sure. As you can see, most of us are elderly, and for us to get from the apartment block to downtown Oakland, to find parking, to walk to the building, to get in the elevator, or wait for the elevator, get in the elevator, come up here, it's all really, really difficult." So after he had shared that, again, I didn't minimize, I acknowledged his emotions, and I said, "It sounds like what's important to you is a venue with easy access." And he was like, "Yeah, that's our valid need. We need a venue with easy access." Now, again, one of the key things that a mediator ensures is that there's structural balance in any conversation. And again, that's actually where having a talking stick is so important, because it's a tool that ensures that you have that structural balance. But the danger is that we just go ahead without hearing from the owners. But I'm on hand, so I say to the owners, "What about you?" So as I say, there were two representatives of the owners, and the elder of the two spoke first, and he said, "Honestly, for us, getting here is not a big deal. We drive up from San Jose in our BMW, come up the 101, cross the bridge, park, come up here, no big deal." But the younger of the two then said something. He said, "But you know what? We've owned this building 2 years now. The tenants, some of them have been there 20, 30 years, and we've had meetings there before, and every time we meet there, it's like they have home field advantage." So again, I acknowledged what I sensed was the need, which was that they needed a neutral venue. So as you can see, and now this is true in any conflict or dispute that you face, you'll always discover beneath the posturing, the positionality of demands and do it my way, there'll always be valid needs waiting for you to discover. And that's what we as good conflict resolvers, as good collaborators do, is we take the time to discover our respective needs. Once we've got our respective needs out, we can brainstorm solutions. Now, oftentimes, and again, that dividing line's gone, they'll start off somewhat positionally. In other words, town hall would have been the owners, apartment block would have been the tenants association. So that comes out, and then someone in the audience didn't take it, probably it was maybe 60 seconds later, said, "You know what? Next door to the apartment block is a church. On the church premises is a meeting hall. Why don't we meet there?" And as you can see, a meeting hall on the church premises provides both easy access and a neutral venue. And this is fundamentally what we're always trying to do as conflict resolvers is, again, I'll just summarize. First, to acknowledge the emotions, allow people to have their feelings acknowledged, reduce some of that sort of charge, and don't try and pretend nothing happened. Once we've done that, we've cleaned out the wound, we can move to the stitching, and to do that, we need to understand what our respective needs are and always know that there will always be valid needs. Each side Even your nemesis is going to have valid needs, and we need to discover those. Once we've got our needs out, we can then come up with solutions that meet those needs. Now, sometimes we need to do a little more. In other words, imagine this is the proverbial table, and we try this problem-solving two-step, and we discover the one side's needs and the other side's needs, and we get some options, some potential solutions, but they don't really meet. They're not really to our liking. There are two further conversations, and both of these also come from getting to yes, that we would pursue in terms of coming up with solutions. The one is to say, what are some external standards or acceptable reference points as to what others have done in these same circumstances? So, for example, this is like when you're buying a secondhand motor vehicle, where you want to bring in the Kelly Blue Book, or you want to bring in precedent, or just laws or regulations or reference points as to what others have done. And this is what ensures that we sense that things feel fair. In other words, we're not being made an exception of. We're in the ballpark of fairness. The other conversation we need to have sometimes is the conversation about what each of us will do on our own away from the table if we don't reach an agreement. For those of you that are familiar with this idiom, this is the bird in the hand versus two in the bush. If we do have two birds in the bush, we should go and take them. But if that's just a pipe dream, sometimes it's better to take the bird in the hand. So the alternatives conversation is really exploring what can we do unilaterally on our own away from the table. And if what we can do away from the table is better, we're not going to be motivated to accept what's on the table. But again, this is the second conversation that we sometimes need to have. And it'll sometimes feel like a little bit of exploring what we're going to do in terms of fight and flight. And this addresses power. Now, I don't have time to go much beyond that, what I've just shared. What I will point to is that the handout that was sent to you, and I know Shweet's going to be sending it through in the chat again to you, is a two-page summary. I pick up on a lot of the points that I've made in this presentation. It'll sort of summarize what we've explored together. There's also a very handy preparation worksheet, and as a tool, which I think has really got great value, I've included the 78 feelings and needs from the empathy set, or the app version of the empathy set. And these are, and I say humbly, not because I'm the true creator of these, I was just a good copycat in terms of this tool that I've called the empathy set, but giving people lists of feelings and needs and orienting them to those help you move in a more positive rather than a negative direction. And with that, we are now at the end of my presentation. And to the extent that anyone has a question or a comment, Shweet's going to be handling those through the chats. And as I say, I'll be happy to answer any questions that anyone has that arises from any or all of what we've shared in this presentation. Let me see.
All right, thank you very much. We'll just imagine a round of applause happening in the background.
All right.
So we do have a couple of questions, and they're from the same person. So I'm going to try to like roll it up into one a little bit. The first one is kind of based off of the circular model that you were showing, where there was judgment. And the second question is going to be based on the justice versus forgiveness and those three, right? So the first question kind of says, basically, if someone is working off of a different truth than you kind of deal, how are you able to recomplete that circle if no matter what the truth? And then the follow-up, they said, based on these two people with different truths, even if the other has, if there's no truth, is the model that you were talking about, the third way to go, still the same way to go? Or is there a new model that should be presented? This is
no. I appreciate that question, because that's like getting to the heart of, like, in other words, I can tell someone's living this, and I believe that probably everyone on this presentation knows exactly what we're talking about. And this is so hard in life, where we are in a conflict with someone else, and there isn't that shared reality of what went down in the past. It's hard enough when there's a shared reality of what went down in the past, but it's even harder, when there isn't. And then and I hate to say this, but as humans, we're sort of limited by these three choices. This is again why I go back to that Rodney King quote of why can't we all get along, and the tragedy that in 2021, we're still spending billion upon billions of dollars trying to figure out how to kill one another in more sophisticated ways, and such a little amount of money on how to get along with one another, how to restore harmony, how to deal with these kind of dilemmas that the sort of the astute questioner is asking about. So, of course, the temptation in these kind of circumstances is when it is like that, when we do appear to have, where it appears that we have different truths, the justice path becomes very appealing, because we hope that we're going to be able to present our version of reality, and it's going to be accepted by that third person, the judge, the jury, the arbitrator, whoever it may be, the investigator, and they're going to see it our way. But what we know, and this is just, you know, the horrible sort of reality of being a human, is that as much as we may know our version to be right and to be the truth because we've experienced it, someone else may not see it the same way that we do. And so that becomes a dilemma. And so even though we go before these fact finders, they don't always see things the way we do. And even if they do, and they make a pronouncement and they make a resolution, the solution that we get to is what I'd call superficial. In other words, they may stitch that wound up, but what they've actually injected into the wound is a whole lot more, I don't know, grit. In other words, it often puts a lot more strain, because the one person may be happy with the outcome, and the other person may be super unhappy. I see this all the time, actually, again, in the workplace, where someone files a complaint and alleges that they're being, say, for example, harassed. So now you've got someone who's making an accusation, and then there's someone who's accused. And then the organization goes and investigates to determine what is the truth. And they find that, yeah, there's some mischief going on in the relationship, but it doesn't amount to legal harassment. And so they say to the two employees, get back to work. Well, the person that made the allegation feels that they weren't supported, and the person that was accused feel like they were unfairly accused. And so now there's even more strain on that relationship. So again, I'll just say that's the dilemma. You have that as that is the tempting path, but it often, people don't always see it our way. And sometimes even when they do, the resolution of it doesn't really address the underlying conflict itself. The benefit of the forgiveness path, and that's sometimes what folks would say, that's more of a deeper spiritual avenue to explore, but it allows us to make peace with life as it's unfolding. It doesn't mean that it's right. It doesn't mean that we're saying it didn't happen, but we make peace with the way things are, and we let go of holding on to what has been painful for us. But in terms of the reconciliation path, the way I sort of frame it, again, something that I add in my presentation is I'll talk about the dilemma of human memory, and the way in which when two people do have a shared experience, and we both with, if I use my hands to represent being on this two people having an experience, the reality is that I can only experience life through my senses, and you can only experience it through your lens. So I'll never actually experience it through your lens, and you'll never experience it through mine. So we have that shared experience together, and then as time draws on, we remember things slightly differently. And so in some ways, it's any wonder that we actually remember things the same way, because a week later, a month later, a year later, you're guaranteed that people are going to have different recalls. So as the mediator, I try to anticipate that. I try to say, as a way to head that off, and to say, it's probable that there will be different recollections of what went down. And I also point out to them, I say, even though you may have different perceptions of what the truth is, in other words, your versions of how things ended up may have deviated. You may remember it one way and the other person may remember it another way. We can still find a solution for the future that is better than what you're experiencing now. And essentially, and I'm sure you've all heard this expression, encourage them to agree to disagree. Now, of course, the resolution is always stronger where there is that shared reality. But sometimes, and again, I try to normalize this more by making memories the mischievous sort of fault, sort of entity to blame in all of this, is to say we all have frail human memories, and that's just the sad reality. And the example actually I give, I always say, I'll say to folks, I bet you all remember where you were when you heard about the Twin Towers coming down on 9/11, and a lot of times people will nod their heads and say yes. And I say, well, do you remember what you did for your birthday that year? And unless their birthday was on 9/11, you start seeing a lot of head scratching as they try to remember and figure it out. I mean, watch a movie, think about the last movie you watched, you know, and then you sit down with someone else who watched that same movie, you're going to be recalling different things. Different things will land as important to you and important for the other one. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is don't be unrealistic in terms of your expectations that the truth as an absolute can be found, that working conflict out means we tolerate a degree of relativism and a little bit of that. We expect that there's going to be a little bit of straying from a single version. But what we also try to do, and this is what I do encourage, and I'll sometimes say it, is we can either focus on being right or being happy. And when we're focusing on being right, it almost always leads us into being unhappy. If we want to be happy, we need to let go of that absolute grip that we sometimes have on things being truthful or being seen by others in the same way that we do. But having said all of that, I want to just end by saying, you know, mediation is not the only way. What I've shared with you obviously leans heavily in the direction of reconciliation as an approach to addressing conflict. And it's not appropriate for everyone. And sometimes there's a sense that, no, I need to have the satisfaction of being heard by a fact finder who finds in my favor. And so mediation is not appropriate for me, or direct conflict resolution with this person is not appropriate, and I'm going to take the justice path. So I don't want to discount that. But in any event, I hope that that's helpful and just sort of reflecting on what is a very common dilemma, that desire for things to be truthful. And maybe here, there's the last little anecdote that I'll share with you. I was once mediating between well, there's in a situation. Basically what happened was I heard about this situation where a young mother had told something in confidence to her manager about her son's medical condition. And as I recall, the medical condition was having an impact on the mother's ability to get to work on time. So she took her manager into her confidence and she shared a little bit about her son's medical condition. In her mind, that was confidential and for the manager's ears only. And a couple of weeks later, another manager from another department reached out to her, or they were talking, and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear about your son." She was like, "What do you mean about my son?" And she said, "Oh, your manager was telling us in our leadership meeting about his condition." Now, she was trying to be compassionate and caring, but what had happened was that confidence had been breached, there'd been a betrayal. And so the mother went and spoke to her manager and said, "You know, I know you may have been well-meaning in sharing that, but to me, you breached my confidence. That information that I shared with you was for your ears only." So now we get to the tricky little part, because instead of the manager acknowledging it and saying, "You're right, you did share with me in confidence. You may not have said that, but I understood it to be confidential information, and it was inappropriate of me to do that. I'm really sorry. I can see how it had a harsh impact on you, despite my good intentions, and I'm really sorry." But the manager didn't. The manager said, "No, I didn't. I wouldn't do that." And there was this denial. And you can see how, when that occurs, right, how hard it becomes then for folks to move on, because there hasn't been that acknowledgement of truth. And that's, again, where I'll just sometimes say, as the mediator, your opportunity is, as much as possible, I'm trying to get people to have a shared reality, notwithstanding the frailty of memory. I'll keep saying to them, you can agree to disagree, and then just agree to say, in the future, we'll be crystal clear about what is confidential, and we'll keep our confidences. But as you can tell, there'll always be some strain in that relationship. There we go. Sorry, I rattled on there a little bit, but it is an important question. Anything more, Shweet?
Actually, I don't know how quick. I was going to say quick follow-up with your answer to the two questions previously.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, is it fair to say that resolution under mediation is not considered justice, based on what you've just said?
That's again, no, that's a great question. Laura Nader, the sister of Rolf Nader, taught for many years. I don't think she teaches there at UC Berkeley, but she would often point out the danger that mediation becomes a form of second-class justice. And so I think there are risks, of that. And again, I think this is where, if justice and holding people accountable and there being a consequence for their actions is what's most important, then I would agree, mediation's not the path. So again, I think it's more about seeing that in life we have these choices and being able to clearly delineate which applies in which circumstance. And in some circumstances, you know, again, I'll go back to that example that I used of Jeffrey Epstein. I wouldn't say mediation would have been at all appropriate in those circumstances. It needed the forum, you know, the criminal justice forum to address a situation like that. But by contrast, you know, that we can debate, there was the Second World War, the Nuremberg trials, the justice path. I'm originally from South Africa at the end of apartheid, which was replete with horrors beyond measure in terms of humans' unkindness to one another and injustices and wrongness in terms of treatment that were truly horrific. And there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that over time, it was seen as beneficial, but it's also been increasingly, there's been a growing critique that it didn't deliver justice, especially the economic justice that would lead to fundamental change in society. And Mandela, in fact, has come in for a lot of flack because he was a big proponent of it, of being too much of a proponent of rainbowism, of just like rah-rah, and let's just all get along and forget the past. So these are, again, what I hope that what we're all getting is that these are fundamental human questions in terms of how we show up and live, how we address Rodney King's question of why can't we all get along, and this dilemma of us still being so fixated on killing one another rather than finding ways of getting to peace, and especially in a situation like this where our lenses in terms of how we're interpreting reality lead us to experience life as being different. And also the dilemma, which I believe everyone on this call will also know, just in that same way. I remember when I said, anyone who hasn't told a lie, raise your hand. And I'd say anyone who thought something was one way only to discover they were mistaken, if that's never happened to you, raise your hand. I suspect there would be no hands that go up for that too. So it's how can we be forgiving of one another for being human, our human condition, and still find a way of getting to a more respectful way of relating and interacting with one another in life.
All right.
All right. Any more there, Shweet?
I think we're good to go. That was great. Again, thank you. Swan, do you have any closing?
I just wanted to say thank you. That was really informative and a useful conversation and reminder for things that some of us have learned before and some of us need to be reminded of, and how we can work together, particularly when we go forward to a new environment that we haven't yet encountered. So thank you again for all of you who are attending. In a few weeks, probably after the holidays, we'll send you a recording of this presentation for you to review and to share. And I hope to see you the next time we have our Innovation in Practice series. And John, thank you again so much. We so appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. And thank you, Shweet and Zenas and Irene and everyone, again, everyone who participated and showed up. Really appreciate it.